Okay, so, we've been getting a ton of questions about the Forged Act and
Yep.
just all the stuff that's been happening around
Okay.
innovation and defense contracting.
Mm-hmm.
And today, we're going to take a really close look
Oh,
at
yeah.
Section 303,
Wow.
which,
Buckle up.
yeah, buckle up. It's got a really interesting title. It's being called NDC Exemptions, Balancing Innovation and Oversight.
Right. And that title kind of gets to the heart of what we're going to be talking about today.
Exactly.
For those of you who might be newer to this whole world, NDC stands for Non-Traditional Defense Contractor.
Right. So we're talking about
Yeah.
companies who are really innovative in the commercial space,
Mm.
but haven't really
Traditionally
Yeah,
worked with the DoD.
Exactly. I mean, and the material you sent over actually references the U.S. Code 10 U.S.C. Section 3014,
Oh, wow.
which gives a very specific definition. But
I'm sure it's fascinating.
yeah, well, maybe we'll link that in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll let our listeners check that out.
Yeah. Okay. So our deep dive today is really about
All right.
trying to figure out what this Section 303 recommendation actually is
Yep.
and why it's being proposed now
Yeah.
and what kind of impacts it could have
On the defense landscape?
across the whole defense world.
Exactly.
And then most importantly, how we actually implement this. How do we put this into practice?
Right. And this is part of a bigger series, right?
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at a lot of different recommendations from the Forged Act.
Yes. So why is this even a thing? What's the background? What led to this recommendation?
Well, I think the driving force behind all of this is really this desire to get innovative technology into the hands of the military.
Right.
That's kind of the core of it. And, as we've been talking about, a lot of that innovation is happening
Outside of
outside the traditional defense.
the big players,
Yeah.
the big defense contractors.
And so, there's this recognition that
Yeah.
we need to find ways to work with these non-traditional companies.
And so that's where the 2016 NDAA came in.
Yeah, exactly. That was kind of the first step where they formally defined what an NDC is
Okay.
and kind of said, okay, we need to start thinking about this.
We need to be serious about this.
And as time went on, you see these reports from the GAO, right?
Yeah.
And some of the analyses that were done on kaisreports.congress.gov started to point out that
Yeah.
the traditional regulations that we have in place, like in the DRs, right? The Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement.
The cost accounting rules.
Yeah, all those cost accounting rules
Yeah.
were actually a major roadblock for
Yeah.
a lot of these companies.
It's kind of like, trying to take a company that's used to moving really fast
right.
and, being really lean and agile
Yeah.
and then forcing them to comply with all these
That's right.
regulations
Right.
that can take years to get through.
And are incredibly expensive.
Exactly.
And so, the Defense Science Board, you can find some of their stuff at dsb.cedo.mil.
Okay.
They actually did some studies.
Oh, interesting.
And they're raising concerns about this.
Okay.
And then, you have initiatives like innovation.defense.gov
Okay.
that were also saying, hey, we need to find some regulatory relief.
So all of this is leading to Section 303.
Yeah, so Section 303 of S.5618,
Okay.
which Senator Wicker introduced in December of 2024.
Okay.
This is essentially kind of the culmination of all these efforts to try to really address this problem.
So it sounds like they realized, hey, these regulations, while important for, the big defense contractors,
Right.
might be preventing us from getting access to some really cool tech.
Right, and there's this long history of this recognition, right?
Okay.
The DoD's been thinking about this.
Yeah.
Congress has been thinking about this.
Mhm.
And, you see it in some of the prior reforms and some of the findings that have been published
Okay.
on discover.dbetic.mil.
So we have a real problem here that they're trying to solve. So what are the desired effects? Let's say this recommendation is successfully implemented. What are we hoping to see?
Well, the material you sent lays out 5 key desired effects.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the ideal outcome here?
The first is pretty straightforward, right?
Okay.
They want to see more NDCs
All right.
participating in defense contracting.
So getting them in the door.
Yeah, exactly.
So that means getting rid of some of those cost accounting barriers that we were talking about.
Yeah. And the second is that, with less of that compliance burden, they're hoping to see faster acquisition timelines.
Okay. So less red tape
Mm-hmm.
means we can get technology to the warfighter faster.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Okay, what else?
Well, the third one, and this is kind of the big one,
Okay.
is that they want to see
Uh,
enhanced access to commercial technology.
right. Because if it's easier for these NDCs to work with the DoD, then the military is going to have access to all this
Exactly.
amazing tech.
That they wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah.
And the fourth one is that they want to reduce the administrative costs for the NDCs themselves.
Okay. So make it easier for them to actually do business with the DoD.
Right. And the fifth one is that they want to foster more competition in the defense industrial base.
Okay. So by making it easier for NDCs to enter the market, you're going to see
More competition.
more competition. Okay.
Exactly.
That all sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah. It all sounds pretty great in theory.
But I'm sure there's a flip side, right? What are the potential downsides? Where could this go wrong?
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's always a flip side.
There's always a but.
And the material you sent actually does a pretty good job of laying out some of the potential negative impacts.
Okay. So let's go through those. What are the worries here?
Well, the first one is reduced oversight, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're not requiring these companies to provide all that detailed cost accounting data, it's going to be harder to track how that money's being spent.
Okay, so that's a big one. So are we going to end up overpaying?
Well, that's the concern. And the second one is that this could actually disadvantage the traditional defense contractors.
So it's like we're giving the NDCs an advantage.
Well, that's what some people are worried about because they're still going to be subject to all those strict regulations.
They're playing by a different set of rules. Okay.
Exactly. And the third concern is that having different sets of rules could complicate contract management for the DoD.
Okay, because you're going to have...
Yeah, you're going to have some contractors who are exempt and some who aren't.
And that's going
to create some...
some headaches.
Some headaches.
Okay.
The fourth one is that it might actually hinder audits and increase the potential for fraud.
Right. If you don't have all the cost data, it's going to be really hard to audit these contracts.
Exactly. And the fifth one is that, if we have this huge influx of NDCs, it could strain the DoD's existing oversight capabilities.
Right. Because they're going to have to figure out how to manage all these...
Yeah, all these new companies.
New companies that are playing by different rules.
Exactly.
So are we trading one problem for another?
That's a great question.
We had this problem of not enough innovation.
Right.
And now we're creating this problem of potentially...
are we creating...
increased financial risk.
Risk and abuse.
Okay. So I guess the big question is, what are we going to do about it? Are there any plans to mitigate these risks?
Yeah. And, to their credit, the recommendation actually includes 5 specific mitigation strategies.
Okay. So they've thought about this. What are they?
So the first one is that even though these NDCs are going to be exempt from the full cost accounting regulation, they will still be required to provide what they're calling simplified cost reporting.
Okay. So we're not...
So not like we're completely in the dark.
We'll still have some visibility.
Right. The second is that to make sure that the traditional contractors aren't disadvantaged, the DoD is going to explore some incentives for those companies.
So maybe like a bonus for complying with all the...
Right. Exactly.
Great.
Exactly. The third one is that they're going to establish some standardized basic oversight protocols that'll apply to all contractors.
All right. So
if you're an NDC...
So a baseline.
Yeah, a baseline level of accountability for everyone.
Okay.
And the fourth one is that they're going to invest in enhanced audit training.
Okay.
And develop new tools that'll help auditors detect fraud, even in the absence of all that detailed cost data.
So they recognize that audits are going to be more difficult?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the fifth one is that they're going to implement these exemptions in phases.
Okay. So it's not going to be...
It's not going to be like a light switch.
Like a light switch. They're going to slowly roll this out.
Yeah. They're going to start small and then gradually expand the program.
So thinking about all these changes, who in the DoD is going to be most affected by this?
Yeah. So the recommendation specifically calls out 3 groups.
Okay. Who are they?
Contracting officers.
Okay.
Acquisition staff.
Okay.
And auditors.
So all the people involved in, the contracting and procurement process.
Right. And they're all going to have to adapt to this new way of doing business.
Because they're used to having all this data.
Right.
And now they're going to have to make decisions.
With less data.
Yeah, with less data.
They're going to have to focus more on performance outcomes and less on, the minutia of cost breakdowns.
So it's a whole new...
Yeah, it's a whole new...
skill set.
Way of thinking. Okay. And then the auditors, right. They're going to need new methodologies, new tools to audit these contracts that don't have all the traditional data.
So it's going to be a lot of training, a lot of
training.
New ways of doing things. Okay. So we talked about who's going to be impacted.
Yeah.
Are there any stakeholders who are going to be opposed to this?
Well, the material you sent actually identifies a few groups who might have some reservations.
Okay, so not everyone's on board with this. Who are we talking about?
Well, the traditional defense contractors, for one.
Yeah, I can see why they might not be thrilled about this.
Right. They might feel like it's creating an uneven playing field.
Yeah, like they're
at a disadvantage.
Yeah, they have to follow all the rules.
Exactly.
And the NDCs get a free pass.
And then you also have congressional budget overseers.
Okay, so they're worried about the financial side of things.
Right. They want to make sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly.
So they're going to want to see how this is going to impact oversight.
Right. And then you also have the DOD auditors themselves.
Oh, interesting.
Right.
So they might not like this either.
Yeah, they might be concerned about the lack of data.
Because it makes their jobs harder.
Right.
So you have all these different groups with different perspectives.
And different concerns. Yeah.
Okay. So this sounds like it's going to require a lot of resources to actually implement?
Yeah, the recommendation actually specifically says that additional resources will be needed.
Okay, so they're aware of that. What kind of resources are we talking about?
Well, they mentioned funding for new oversight tools.
Okay.
And then also training for DOD personnel.
Right, because everybody's going to have to learn how to do things
in this new way.
Yeah, this new way.
And they also mentioned potentially needing additional staff.
Right, to handle all the extra work. So how are they going to measure whether this is actually working?
Yeah, so they've laid out 3 key performance indicators that they're going to be tracking annually.
So every year they're going to check in and see how we're doing. Okay, what are they looking at?
Well, the first is the number of contract awards to NDCs.
Okay.
And they're hoping to see a 20% increase.
So more NDCs winning contracts.
Right. The second is reductions in acquisition timelines.
Okay, so they want to see that things are moving faster.
Exactly. 15% faster to be exact.
Wow, that's a pretty aggressive goal. Okay, and what's the last one?
And the last one is they want to see how much new technology is being adopted.
Okay.
So they're looking at the rate of new tech uptake.
From these NDCs?
And they want to see at least a 25% increase.
So they're really looking at this from all angles.
Yeah, they want to make sure that this is actually...
That this is working.
That this is working.
So were there any other options? Were there any other ways that they considered tackling this?
Yeah, the material mentions a couple of alternative approaches that were considered.
Okay. Tell me about those.
One was the idea of using tailored DFARS waivers.
Okay.
Specifically for NDCs.
So instead of these blanket exemptions.
Yeah, blanket exemptions.
Okay.
And the other one was to run a pilot program.
Okay. So kind of test
it out.
Test it out on a small scale.
On a smaller scale before going.
See how it goes.
Exactly.
Before we go all in.
Okay.
And maybe even, get some ideas from some of the initiatives on innovation.defense.gov.
So for those of you listening, what's the takeaway here? What do you need to know? Whether you're part of an NDC or a traditional defense contractor, or you're working within the DoD, how should you be thinking about this and preparing for these potential changes? Well, I think for NDCs, this is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Keep an eye out for announcements about which regulations are going to be exempt.
Yep.
And then familiarize yourself with the new reporting requirements.
Right, because there's still going to be some reporting.
Exactly. And then start thinking about how your technology can meet the needs of the military.
And for the traditional contractors, what should they be doing?
I think the big thing is to understand that the competition is going to change.
It's going to get tougher.
Yeah. And you're going to need to highlight your unique value proposition.
So what makes you stand out?
Exactly. And then also keep an eye out for any incentive programs.
Right. So those
that might be put in place.
Those bonuses we talked about. Okay, so what about for the people working within the DoD?
Well, get ready for some training.
Okay.
You need to learn how to manage these contracts with NDCs.
Right. Because it's a whole new way of doing things.
You're going to have to learn to evaluate performance instead of just looking at costs.
And for the auditors, it's going to be new techniques and new tools.
Exactly. And for everyone listening, Just stay informed.
Right. This is a
big change,
Yeah.
and it's going to be rolled out in phases.
So pay attention to what's happening. Pay attention to those annual reports.
Yeah, those reports are going to tell you how this is all working.
So we're going to get data on how many contracts are being awarded to NDCs.
Right.
We're going to see if the timelines are actually getting shorter, and we're going to see if these new technologies are being adopted.
Exactly.
So Section 303 of the Forged Act, it's a pretty bold move to try and bring in more innovative companies.
Yeah.
And by easing some of those regulatory burdens.
Yeah.
But it definitely requires careful management.
Absolutely.
And adaptation.
And vigilance.
Vigilance, yes.
Because there are some.
There are some risks.
Definitely some risks.
Okay. Well, I think that was a really informative deep dive.
I hope so.
I learned a lot
Like that.
about this section of the Forged Act.
Yeah.
And for our listeners, here's a final thought for you.
Okay.
You know, we're seeing this huge push for technological advancement in the defense sector, right?
Absolutely.
And this whole issue of balancing oversight with innovation.
It's a tricky balance.
It is a tricky balance. So
Yeah.
how is this going to continue to shape
How does this get
defense acquisition strategies?
relevant over time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beyond just this one recommendation.
That's the question
Yeah.
to ponder.
Yeah. So think about that. And join us for our next deep dive where we'll be looking at another key recommendation from the Forged Act.
Can't wait.